Hello, welcome to Live at Epiphan. This is episode 38. I'm your host, George.
And I'm Dan.
And today we got a bunch of stuff. So what are we talking about today, Dan?
Well, we got a big topic. HDMI 2.1 has, the spec has officially been released. So we're going to chat about that a little bit. We're also going to talk about a big product launch here at Epiphan. We've got AV Studio, which was just released this week. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. And a variety of news items, which you may find interesting. So stay tuned in.
Yeah, so definitely if you guys have any questions as we go through the show, put them into chat, send us an email, live@epiphan.com with any offline questions you want or future suggestions. Of course, like, follow, subscribe, all those things. But please, engage in chat, throw us your questions as we go through a bunch of these different topics. As Dan said, there's some interesting ones coming up, so look forward to seeing that.
Yeah, so once again, we're going to be talking about HDMI 2.1 today. We're also going to be talking about AV Studio. But before we get to all that, we do have some news that we wanted to cover. So, George, what's on the news docket today?
So, first, the news. There's a lot of stuff. I guess coming up right after we're done is Photo Joseph. Yeah, 4 o'clock Eastern is Photo Joseph and B&H doing their live stream, beginner to pro streaming. So I think they're going to be talking about a bunch of really cool stuff. They were doing it from the store in New York, B&H store, I think. So you could actually have probably too late now, but you could have registered to attend in person, which would have been cool. You do also have to register to watch it online. It's free, of course, but you do have to register. So if you haven't done so yet, check that out. And
there is a link in the video description down below. You can just go to, I think it's photojoseph.com/BH.
Yeah, so check that out. I know I'm going to be watching as soon as we're done here.
I'm interested because he's going to be playing with a bunch of Lumix cameras as well.
Yeah.
And those are just great cameras for especially the Webcaster X2. So if you want to learn a little bit about some cameras that might work well with your Webcaster X2, that's a good stream to check out. So check the link in the video description down below, and you can go watch it right after this.
Yeah, definitely. What else do we have?
Webcaster has had some updates recently.
Yes.
So the 2.1 update recently was released. So you're going to see from time to time updates to your firmware on your Webcaster X2. We, of course, recommend that you do those updates. It will keep your Webcaster up to date with all of the latest features and compatibility. But this one may be a little different because you're going to notice something new with your Webcaster.
Yeah, so there's a couple highlights in this new update. Maybe we'll leave that really interesting one as the last one we mentioned. But a couple of them there is sort of some maintenance stuff. One of them is there's an option now to change the EDID. I don't want to go too in-depth on what that means right now, but basically it can switch between two different compatibility modes for the HDMI input. So one camera versus another may behave differently, so there's a switch there for compatibility modes. There's also some slight updates to the beta feature for using USB inputs.
Cool.
So a lot of people actually do use that USB input option for webcams and things like that. There's some options in there now to take audio from that as well. So that's still beta. It's not finalized, and we have seen a couple camera models that seem to not quite do the audio properly. So we're working on those cameras. I've tested it with the new Razer Kaio webcam.
That's a cool webcam.
Yeah, we might talk a little bit about that more in the future. But yeah, that was when I was playing with the Webcaster a few days ago. Let's see, what else was in there?
With the 2.10 update? Well, we have an update you're going to notice that allows you to pair your Webcaster with a service called AV Studio. We're going to get to that later in the episode, so if that's interesting to you, stick around. We'll explain what it's all about.
As a side note to that, if AV Studio, after you hear about it, is not something you're interested in, and having that third application option on your Webcaster is just kind of messing with your workflow, a new feature is you can actually disable some of the apps. So there are 3 apps on the Webcaster: Facebook, YouTube, and now AV Studio. If you're only ever going to use one of those, you can disable the other 2 and not have to worry about cycling through them accidentally. So that's a new feature.
That's nice. I mean, that makes it a little bit easier. Another news item. I thought this was really interesting last week. I know many of you out there are probably familiar with Neil Young, big rock star, folk singer,
Canadian hero,
legend, all-time legend. He actually did a live stream last week.
Yeah, I heard about that. I didn't catch it, but I couldn't find it the day it was on.
So he live streamed to Facebook on his Facebook page.
Okay.
He also, here in Canada, however, they sort of blocked that out, and the live stream went through one of our major broadcasters here in Canada, ctv.ca. So if you're in the United States, you can still watch the live stream on Neil Young's Facebook page. So I would recommend you do that. Actually, I got a clip here. Why don't we can show a little bit of it, I suppose.
But that explains why I wasn't able to catch that, and that's because I was locked out being in Canada.
Yeah, I mean, you could have watched it on ctv.ca, but they took it down. But apparently they're going to play it on television this Sunday at 9 o'clock. So you can watch it then. But what's interesting with this is, so this was all sort of a promotion for Neil Young's new album that's, I guess, coming out soon. But rather than playing a large venue, he actually went to his hometown of Omemee, Ontario, population like 1,000.
Yeah.
And he played in like the local, I think it's like the local
bar or something. Yeah.
It's like a Legion Hall or something like that. Yeah. So there was like a couple hundred people who were lucky enough to be invited, who he did the live stream for. But it obviously got a ton of views online. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people watched from around the world. There was also some donations happening for Neil Young's charity, which is called the Bridge School. So they raised some money for disadvantaged kids. And the thing that I found interesting with this live stream, I mean, if you love Neil Young, I don't have to pitch it to you. You already know why you're going to want to watch it. But the thing that I found interesting was just how laid back and relaxed, and the banter between songs, and really the intimate experience that was captured. I mean, had he done the live stream in a larger venue, it might not have had that effect.
Be the same.
But he was, chatting to people who are sitting 10 feet away,
but
talking
he also
about
managed
his
to
guitars.
reach a couple 100,000 people.
Yeah,
because he live streamed it.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
I think that's the cool thing, and we've probably said this 100 times on this show, that the live streaming capability gives you that power to do a small intimate venue, but expand your audience well outside that room. So that's very cool.
Yeah, really, really cool. So if you want to check it out, go to Neil Young Facebook, or if you're here in Canada, you'll have to watch it on CTV Sunday night. We have something else. This is kind of a funny story. Why don't you kick it off, George?
All right. So funny thing happened, I guess, not long ago during the last UFC event. That many of you may know that the UFC is pretty particular about keeping their content strictly controlled as a copyright holder, and they really don't like people restreaming or rebroadcasting their stuff.
Well, obviously it's pay-per-view, right?
So right. They don't make any money when people do that. But someone decided that they had found a loophole. So a guy on Twitch, which is normally a game streaming platform, decided that he was going to essentially pretend to be playing a UFC video game, but actually be rebroadcasting and streaming the UFC event.
Yeah, here's a little clip. So he did this sort of picture-in-picture, and he held a video game controller.
Yeah.
And that was enough to, I guess, fool the Twitch copyright bots.
Yeah, for a day or two, because he eventually, all his VOD, everything like that, did get taken down. But I got to give him a little bit of credit for the creativity to try and find that loophole, and it's kind of interesting. But
he did get banned from Twitch, but it was only a 24-hour ban. Surprisingly, I'm surprised his account wasn't closed.
That may change because people are talking about this.
But I mean, this is, I think, an interesting topic because it does raise some interesting questions about copyright-related issues surrounding live streaming.
Yeah, exactly, and we've been hearing more and more recently, even people doing Facebook live streaming, which up until this point, Facebook really hasn't had any copyright bots flagging people's live streams. But we have been seeing reports of people getting copyright flags from music and other content in their Facebook streams now, which seems to be, I guess, a hidden deployment that Facebook's working on. It's inevitable that it would eventually happen. So yeah, that's something to keep in mind, as always, that if you're reusing someone else's content that's copyrighted, be careful. Just be aware of what you're doing. Make sure you're licensed to rebroadcast.
I think another warning that we'd want to just sort of let people know about is we had talked a little bit about streaming live events, right? And what happens when those live events contain copyright protected music? Well, in some cases, from what we understand, now I can't say this with certainty, but I believe that there might be cases where after your live stream ends, Facebook may not convert that stream to a video on demand if there's like line level copyright protected music playing over the stream.
Right. In the case of YouTube, you may be banned from live streaming altogether for the future. In the case of Twitch, you may get a 24-hour ban and then be back at it or something until a permanent ban sets in. So, as these policies evolve and as platforms figure out how to deal with it, these things are going to be a little bit variable. So, I mean, obviously, at the end of the day, you should not be using anyone else's material without authorization and licensing, but sometimes it happens accidentally. So,
just something to be aware of.
Yeah.
Other news. This is kind of interesting. Well, I'm sure lots of you are hearing about Bitcoin in the news. It's a very popular topic, especially this week.
I didn't know this was going to be an episode to try and make me cry. But someone who used to hold several Bitcoins, watching this stuff now is a little upsetting. But you can't play that regret game. It's just not the way life is.
Yeah. George was just telling me about his Bitcoin mining days. Now, I've never been a miner myself, but I do have a little Bitcoin. And I'm excited to say that if you go onto the Epiphan website, you can actually use Bitcoin to purchase Epiphan products.
You can, yeah. So there's a little notice up there at the top. When you go into the cart, it's one of the payment options. We do use, obviously, a third-party plugin to make sure everything's on the up and up. But it is possible to buy Epiphan equipment with Bitcoin.
Very cool.
So, yeah. And for anyone who's been holding on to Bitcoin at the current prices, that means you could get a Webcaster for very, very little.
Yeah, no kidding.
But yeah, that's I don't want to. Bitcoin is killing me. It's killing me.
George, we could start our own Bitcoin mining project. We'd have to put up some solar panels, though.
Electricity's kind of expensive here.
Yeah.
But, and I'm not going to be making any promises like John McAfee did, because that's just crazy. And I'm not even going to mention or quote what he said, but he claims that it'll be worth $1 million by 2020. So.
Well, I guess we'll have to wait and see.
And his bet on that is extreme. If anyone doesn't know about that, you can look it up for yourself.
McAfee's a character.
He's nuts. Anyway, but that's an extreme bet. He might not be wrong, though. So at the current pace, here in Canada, I think it hit over $21,000 Canadian this morning. So things are getting crazy. Anyway.
Yeah, cool. So you can buy Epiphan products with Bitcoin, and why don't you go take a look at what we have available now. We've got actually some updates with our Pearl lineup as well. Our Pearl 1 is actually reaching end of life now, so Pearl 2, there's actually some options for a Pearl 2 base model. Can you explain that a little bit?
So typically Pearl 2 comes with its full suite of 4K capabilities and things like that. And we had the earlier version of Pearl for people who only needed HD or were looking for a slightly lower cost version. So now with Pearl 1, that's not its official name, but it's the best way
Original
to refer
Pearl.
Original Pearl, Pearl EV, it has a lot of being phased out as supplies run out. Something else kind of needed to fit that spot. So we will have a version of Pearl 2 in a base model. So Pearl 2 minus the 4K capabilities that will be at a lower price than the full 4K version, so that people have options on what they might need for whatever their budget is. So keep an eye out for that. Some announcements and things like that went out to our mailing list today. There will be more information coming in the near future. And of course, if you buy through any of our partners, contact them and they'll have information for you as well.
Fantastic. Why don't we check in with chat? How's everybody doing out there?
Yes, we do have a couple of things in here. Lots of just, hi, how's it going? And hi. One person was asking about Vimeo Live with Webcaster X2. We've had that question a couple times. That's a pretty good question. I think all we can really say about that right now is no immediate announcements or plans to say there. Vimeo Live is a very new platform. They're still trying to figure out a lot of the things, and Pearl is an authorized and recommended encoder for it. And so, we'll have to see if they create an API that works similarly to Facebook or YouTube. time will tell. But
I think the thing is, right now, Vimeo is entirely RTSP stream based.
Right,
There
it's
is
just
no
that push the way Pearl does it. It's not an API integration the way Webcaster does.
So we'll have to wait and see. But I mean, the Vimeo platform is in its infancy as a live streaming platform. So let's give it a little bit of time and see how things develop. You never know.
Exactly. And, if anyone from Vimeo is watching, if you want to work with us on that, just, give us a shout.
Yeah, let us know.
That's about all the real questions I see right now. There's some people who say they have AVIO 4K and they're loving it, so that's fantastic. Glad to hear it. Let us know if you have any questions about your AVIO 4K or any way we might be able to help take your love to just infatuation, and we'll see what we can do to help.
Okay, so why don't we jump into our big main topic for today? And today we're going to be talking about HDMI 2.1. But before we can talk about HDMI 2.1, I think we just have to talk about HDMI in general. So, first of all, HDMI, high definition multimedia interface.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yeah. So HDMI has been around for quite a while now, and I don't know how many of you out there actually realize that it has version numbers to it. Certainly in the beginning, no one really knew. And I think with HDMI 2.0 coming out a year, 2 years ago, something like that, people started to be more aware of different versioning numbers on it. I think most people just considered that it was a cable you plugged from your Blu-ray to your TV and that was it. But no, there's a lot more to it than that. And it really dictates a lot of the technology underneath it. So there's an organization, just like there is for USB and Wi-Fi and all these other standards. There is a standards organization for HDMI. They are the ones who come up with these versions and what qualifies under that version. So the other day, 2.1 was announced. I would say probably a very high percentage of people today are only using 1.4.
HDMI 1.4.
And that's okay. There is nothing wrong with that. 1.4, it will allow up to 10 gigabits per second of data.
I've got a diagram here. Why don't we take a look?
Pull that up.
So really, like these different versions of HDMI, the key, if you're going to boil it down to one key factor, it's the bandwidth. It's the amount of data that the interface can push.
Exactly.
Right?
I mean, no different than your internet connection, really. It's all about bandwidth. It's a question of how much data can you push through in a given amount of time.
So HDMI 1.4, 10.2 gigabits per second.
Yep.
HDMI 2, I guess you got to move your head, 18 gigabits per second.
Yeah.
And now with the announcement of the HDMI 2.1 standard, that's more than doubling to 48 gigabits per second. That's crazy.
So what does that mean? Well, HDMI 1.4 can do up to 4K 30 FPS at usually about 30 hertz. 2.0 can do 4K 60 FPS. HDMI 2.1 will be able to do as much as 10K compressed or 8K uncompressed.
That's insane.
That's
a lot of pixels.
I mean, you're doubling 4K. That's crazy. That's crazy. I mean, I don't even know what I could use it on.
Yeah.
I mean,
I've got a little image here that we can sort of show.
This is a pretty good one.
This is resolutions, right? So, we're all familiar with full HD. That's what most people are watching this on YouTube right now in full HD.
And I would argue that most people are perfectly content and happy with, and that's the TV they have in their house, and everything's good.
Yeah. And now we're starting to see 4K TVs, right?
They're cheap. They've been around for a long time, but now they're cheap.
Now they're affordable to most consumers.
Oh yeah,
right?
you can get a 4K TV for $500 or $600 now.
However, if you buy a 4K TV today, it may not necessarily have HDMI 2.0, is that right?
It may be 1.4, yeah. So 2.0 also added things like HDR, True Color, these sorts of other technologies. And again, that's another area where 2.1 expands even farther. It's not just the resolution, but it's dynamic HDR. It's got all these other pieces for high frequencies, low latency because of the bandwidth. One that I actually think, because I find really interesting, partly because I don't know how it's going to take shape yet, is the eARC, the audio part of it. That stuff, I don't even know what that's going to mean yet.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about some of these features, because obviously 10K resolution, that's insane. there aren't 10K cameras that people can go out there and purchase, or 10K screens that we can watch this on, right?
But
this is future
affordably, because Red makes some cameras that can do those sorts of resolutions.
Right. But to be able to,
so unless you got rich on Bitcoin, you didn't buy one.
But if we look here, I mean, I'll move a little bit, but there's all these, all these features that are also included. And this table, you can find it on the HDMI forum. You'll find all the information you need here. But there's a handful of new features to HDMI 2.1. So one of them is variable refresh rate technology. That's kind of interesting. Yeah,
and for those of us that are gamers that have had that battle of, am I an NVIDIA person who uses an NVIDIA graphics card and I want high frequency, so I go with an NVIDIA supported monitor so that I can get the highest refresh rates? Am I an AMD person and I need FreeSync? This technology could actually mean that we're dealing with one of those a similar standard that is free from both of those companies, that is based on HDMI standard, so that we may see G-Sync and FreeSync thrown out the window.
So who's that really relevant to? Gamers? People playing console video games?
I mean, I think we may see next generation consoles that will, have never adopted those technologies because it was never something that was used in TVs. So, those of us who do PC gaming, who enjoy those sorts of things, this will allow, I think, console-based gaming to then take advantage of these types of technologies.
Which reduces tearing, which reduces frame stuttering, and basically creates a smoother, fluid motion experience.
Exactly.
Right? So that's pretty cool.
So yeah, that part's really interesting.
Expanded, so HDMI 2.1 will feature expanded HDR technologies, including dynamic metadata. So dynamic metadata, here's how I would explain it. The HDR standard that we have right now, most people probably have, if you do have an HDR TV, unless you spent a lot of money and it's like an OLED TV, you probably have something like HDR10, which is storing the metadata for your HDR. So it's the tone mapping, how to actually translate those super bright brights and super dark darks, how to tone map those onto your screen.
Let's step back for a second. I think most people's exposure to HDR is shooting in HDR on their smartphone.
Right.
Like most people don't think about it outside of that.
Which is really, it's almost a new term now, reinventing the term high dynamic range for display technology.
So what does that mean when we're talking about on a TV?
Well, on a TV, HDR, so I actually recently got my own HDR TV, and I've been quite impressed with it. What it means for most people is that you'll have brighter brights, darker shadows, and a greatly expanded range of colors that your TV is capable of displaying, which produces a much more vivid picture, greater sense of depth. Brighter brights and darker darks create a larger contrast ratio. So what it really does is it makes the color and the depth and the perception of depth in the image much greater.
So this dynamic HDR just means that it's going to be able to change with the content a little quicker, keep up? Is that the idea?
So with HDR10, which is some of the HDR technology that exists right now, Dolby Vision does have dynamic HDR technology, but with HDR10, the metadata that actually tone maps that color space and that range of bright and dark picture, it's stored at the beginning of the file, if you will. So there's one set of metadata for the entire video or film or movie that you're watching, whereas with Dolby Vision and with HDMI 2.1's enhanced HDR dynamic metadata, the tone mapping of the scene you're watching can change throughout the film, or even on a frame-by-frame basis, which means that in a scene with, let's say you're in the forest at night and there's a lot of dark...
You're in the jungle in the rain.
Yeah, like what we're doing right now. You're going to be able to see a lot better in those darker color palettes. But then if the next scene perhaps has bright sunshine or an explosion, it's going to be able to adjust the tone mapping of your display for the specifics of the scene that you're watching, which should result in a better picture quality.
That, combined with some of the other things, really does mean that with HDMI 2.1, we're getting even closer to that like legit cinema in your living room.
Oh, absolutely.
So that's really awesome. Yep. So, that's interesting. Like many things, though, the difference between the HDMI forum announcing this spec and it actually being on the shelf of your local Best Buy. These are very disconnected. I wouldn't expect to turn around even in 2018 and find an HDMI 2.1 TV on the shelf.
Probably not.
Probably 2019,
maybe
2020 kind of time frame. It takes a while, especially for 8K. You know, the size of panel to do that right at initially is going to be fairly large or very expensive. Yeah. So it's...
And also the content is really... So right. The HDMI standard, now that it is announced and it's specified, content creators can start to project into the future on how to create the content that can take advantage of these technologies.
Yeah.
Right now, however, I mean, when we're talking about all of these high resolutions, higher frame rates, greater color depth, it's really, we're not capable of even transmitting, like we've got this, we're announcing this big fat pipe for HDMI 2.1, but to be able to fill that pipe with the data is going to take some time, right?
Exactly. It's definitely going to take some time, but it's exciting news, and I think it offers some great possibilities for the future of video in general, and definitely something we're going to be keeping our eyes on to see how we can hopefully make the most of it.
Yeah. So do you guys have any questions about HDMI 2.1? Let us know in chat. We're always monitoring Facebook and YouTube.
Yep. Right there.
I think, so where do you think you're going to see this first?
I think it'll definitely be home theater first. You know, that's usually where these technologies really start to take off. You know, probably means someone's going to go back and look at, okay, how are we realistically going to get an 8K movie with fully, you know, full HDR onto a Blu-ray? Honestly, with this amount of data, it's very realistic. We may end up with a new media standard. I hate to say that for those of us that can remember, you know, all the way back to even Betamax versus VHS stuff. Laserdisc, and then, you know, CDs, DVDs, Blu-ray, HD DVD, all those other things, right? You know, a single Blu-ray typically is about 50 gig on one disc. Mm-hmm. We're talking about a huge amount of data to do 8K or even 10K data. You know, I don't know, and movies are only be getting longer. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, right.
So I don't know, fitting an 8K 3-hour movie onto a single Blu-ray, I think is...
But we do have new compression technologies on the horizon. H.265 is starting to take shape.
You know, there'll be some changes, I think, and at the same time, digital media and digital delivery is growing. So, you know, are we going to see 8K Netflix? Well, I don't want to know what my internet bill is going to be if I have to do that.
Well, I'll tell you who is saying that they're going to be broadcasting in 8K. Sony and Panasonic are starting to plan for 2020 because NHK, which is the national one of the large broadcasters in Japan, is planning to broadcast some of the 2020 Olympics in 8K.
Interesting.
So it's interesting. This broadcaster, NHK, they've been... really ahead of the curve. I mean, Japan has some great technologies, obviously, but they were doing like HD back in the 80s. Right.
Well, you know, and not to sound too pessimistic about this, but you know, even places like the NFL were shooting in 4K long before anyone was broadcasting in 4K. But even today, who's actually viewing it in 4K? Most of their audience is watching it in HD. So, you know, there is this a little bit of chicken and egg scenario, right? Like you have to start shooting it in order to use it, but is it really worth it until the viewers can watch it? You know,
yeah,
we'll see. But this is a good start.
Yeah, I guess we'll see. Now, I mean, Sony and Panasonic are saying that they'll have 8K TVs in 2020. I guess we'll have to wait and see if that happens. There are a few 8K panels available actually right now, surprisingly enough.
We saw that one at Infocom back in the summer, right?
I've got a clip of it here. So this was at Infocom back in June. This is, what you're looking at here is, I'm just taking some cell phone video, but this is an 8K monitor.
It's a Samsung one, right?
Yeah, this is by Dell, actually. Yeah. And, I mean, you can kind of tell, but when I zoom my camera phone in here, you could not see the pixels at all.
No,
I mean, the pixel density on a display like this is just absolutely insane.
I was pretty blown away by that one when I saw it.
My question when I saw it is, how are they driving the panel? So I believe maybe that this may have had 2 display ports powering it.
But that's the other beauty of something like HDMI 2.1 is that the necessity to run parallel signals like DisplayPort disappears, right?
Yeah.
We now have the connectivity to do it with a single cable.
I mean, we may even see the HDMI 2.1 being used for large display walls or large LCD screens at events. Who knows? Right. So, definitely something to keep your eye on. If you do have any questions, let us know.
Yeah.
Next up, what are we chatting about next there, George?
Well, we wanted to introduce the new product, service, thing, wonderful tool. There's a lot of things I guess you could categorize it as, but AV Studio, which is a new thing from Epiphan. If you want to know more, you can go to avstudio.com. That's where Dan is right now, checking it out. This is a very interesting thing that we're launching. It basically gives you the ability to this is a tough one. I've been slowly trying to learn the best way to communicate this to people, because it's really something that's targeted at someone who is an AV professional who needs to record a lot of data all at the same time with minimal manpower. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of components to this. Definitely check out the website. Dan's playing the video of himself. There's no ego here at all. But,
I'm towering over you, George.
Yeah. But he actually, that little video that we have up on our YouTube channel and is on avstudio.com maybe says it better than I can in terms of getting to the quick, easy breakdown of how AV Studio can give you low-touch recording.
Yeah, well, I think really the way to think about this is, I've been to conferences and I've done video production at conferences where you have many seminars happening, many cameras rolling, many speeches that you want to capture in a very short amount of time.
But you can't clone yourself.
No, you can only be in one place at one time, have one camera rolling, right? So collecting all of that footage from many different areas within inside an event. Yeah. Maybe you have several breakout rooms in an event. Just the logistics of capturing all of that video, taking your memory cards, transferring them, handing them off, taking those files, sending them to your client, packaging them. Yeah. Once you have many rooms and many different speeches that you might want to capture in a single event, the logistics of actually doing that becomes quite complex and requires a large crew and a lot of people and a lot of time. AV Studio simplifies all of that with low touch production.
With a lot of people and a lot of time comes a lot of money. Right?
Correct.
More people to fly there, more people to put in the hotel, more people to feed, more people to pay. I mean, to put it any more simply. And so again, like you're saying, the idea here is to minimize that while still being able to produce as much content for the client as possible in those scenarios. And
so what would you actually do? You take a video encoder, a Webcaster X2.
Webcaster X2, which, as we mentioned earlier, Webcaster X2 now has that app built into it for AV Studio. Just like Facebook or YouTube, it pairs to your AV Studio account using a pairing code. And once you have an account on AV Studio, basically it takes that data and automatically uploads it to AV Studio, which is in the cloud. And you have access to that data where you can do editing.
Cloud-based editing.
Cloud-based editing, cloud-based rendering, which means you don't have to have Adobe on your laptop. You just need a web browser. You don't need to have a high-powered machine. Mm-hmm. You don't even have to have an on-site editor. You could have someone on the other side of the world doing your editing for you in the cloud, and that's a huge, powerful tool.
Yeah, I mean, you could have one person who you don't even need to bring to the event who can start and stop all of those webcasters remotely, who can set recording times and then watch those video sources live and be able to take those perhaps speeches or seminars and very quickly with low touch, with very little effort, be able to set your in and out points on an edit, add pre-roll, and then render and send those video files to your clients. Deliver them as quickly as possible. Yeah. And you can be doing it on a laptop that's a low-power machine. You don't need to have a powerful video editing system, which is very cool.
But the other thing is that, as you know all too well, sometimes when you're using traditional editing software, when you put a project into render, your machine's tied up.
Yeah, you can't do anything
else. You just got to sit back and wait. In the cloud, you don't have to wait. You move on to the next project.
Yeah.
Put it together,
start
throw
editing
it in the
next
rendering
thing.
queue,
Yeah.
go into the next one. You don't have to stop. You can just keep rolling through. So I think for the AV Pro, who does a lot of this kind of stuff, especially, the conference breakout room kind of stuff, I think it's going to be an amazing
set it and forget it, really.
Exactly.
Set up your encoder, set up your camera. You got a 3-day conference, set up your camera in each room with an encoder, walk away. You can go back to your hotel room and manage your video workflow
you can do
from
it from
there.
the bar.
Yeah, that's a great.
Let's look at the
pop a beer.
things here.
Everybody thinks you're working really hard, but really AV Studio is doing all the work for you.
So I think it's really cool. So definitely check it out. If you guys have any questions about AV Studio, you can put them into chat now or send us an email. Really interested in your thoughts.
Show a little bit of the interface as well.
We'll give them a little sneak peek.
A little
here
sneak behind the scenes. So here's an example of like a conference. Now we've got several encoders that set up that recorded this conference, and there's actually the slides from the conference were recorded as well. So here you can see throughout the day it actually synchronizes all of your footage based on time of day. So let's say you start your encoder at 8 a.m. and the conference is going to run till 5 or 6 p.m. You just click once on your Webcaster to be encoding it in real time, and then at the end of the day you can go and say, that session at 10 a.m. in room B, I want to take that. You can set your in and out points here just like in a traditional nonlinear video editing system. So I'll drag some in and out points, okay, and maybe I want to be able to add the lecture notes, the PowerPoint from the session again, so I can do like a 2 up here or a picture in picture. Okay, so let's add a picture in picture, and let's use for my A source, we'll use
the other device.
Yeah, we'll use the slides from the presentation. So there you go. We've got our slides, we've got our lecture or our speaker, all perfectly synchronized, and I can set my in and out points and render that out right away. Now, one of the questions people have is, okay, this is obviously going to require bandwidth. It's going to require a reliable internet connection. So what happens if the internet in your venue is a little wonky?
So that's the other beauty part of this, is that with Webcaster in AV Studio mode, you can insert an SD card into the SD card slot on Webcaster, and it uses that as a local buffer to record. So even if you don't have an active internet connection to constantly be uploading this, it can sit there on that SD card. You can connect it to a network later or when it's faster or whatever, and it'll dump the data then.
That's great.
So it makes it a lot easier that maybe it's entirely offline that day, or maybe it is bottlenecked and things aren't going very fast. Doesn't matter. You can just leave it. It'll buffer it locally and send it when it can.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, so that helps a lot.
So AV Studio, if you have questions, obviously you can get in touch with us here at Epiphan. You can email us live@epiphan.com. We'd be happy to give you a demo of AV Studio. So if it's interesting to you, let us know, and we'll give you a tour of the platform. Any other questions in chat? Anybody have any topics on your mind that you'd like us to discuss? Let us know. Maybe we can talk about next week's show. Actually, we're going to have a really interesting show next week. We're going to be having a software streaming showdown, Smackdown.
Yeah, that's going to be an interesting one. I'm still in the process of preparing for that one.
Software streaming. How are people doing it?
So this is actually coming out of a little bit of last week's show. We did that frequently asked questions for support kind of thing, which I got a lot of feedback. People really liked that show, so we might have to do that one again. But one of the big ones is, what's the best software for live streaming? And that's a tough question because there are a lot of options.
There are a lot of options, and I don't think theres one clear answer of which is the best.
No,
there's
so
different pros and cons to each.
So we wanted to break it down. We're going to look at what we've chosen as a top few choices, and we will go through and say, okay, here's the pros and cons of these top options, and which workflow is going to be the best for you is the decision that you have to look at. So stay tuned next week. That's going to be a good one, I think. maybe we'll even get a few more voices other than just us for that one, because there's a lot to talk about.
Yeah, we'll have a lot to chat about next week with software streaming. So let us know in advance if you have anything questions about software streaming, whether it's OBS, XSplit,
vMix,
Wirecast. Let us know your questions. Have you tried these? Let us know what your experiences are. Yeah. We'll definitely chat about it on the show.
For sure. But I think that does it for this week. I mean, there are a couple questions and comments here in chat. Scott, I see that there in terms of our packaging for AV Studio. Drop us an email, Scott, and let's talk about that. See what we might be able to do for that. In turn, someone else is asking about, is it possible to record the stream to the SD card for Facebook or YouTube? No. Again, because of how Webcaster functions in terms of integrating with the APIs for those platforms, the SD card is not used in those modes. But of course, if your stream is under 4 hours when you go to Facebook or YouTube, it's automatically archived for VOD unless you tell it not to. So you don't really need to locally record it. It's already recorded in the cloud.
Mm-hmm. And if you need a way to download from YouTube, there's a lot of apps. Just do a Google search.
If you own the channel, you can just go into the Creator Studio and download it. You can do that on Facebook too. If you own that page, you can go in and download it. Providing you're the owner, because no stealing.
Yeah.
But I think that does it for today. So thanks everyone for joining us. Again, if you have any questions, please reach out. Happy to help and answer any of those questions you have. But I think for this week, looking forward to next week's showdown. I'm George.
I'm Dan.
And we'll see you soon.
So long.